Hello, it's Mrs. Banneker, and I'm going to talk to you guys about parentheses and dashes. These are two special pieces of punctuation that you can use every now and then in your writing to make it a little bit more interesting. They're very similar in the way that they're used, which is why we pair them together. However, they're on opposite ends of the emphasis spectrum. Parentheses are used to play down information or de-emphasize information. Dashes are used to draw your attention to something, so they are used to add emphasis. So just remember that when you are using these, you want to be mindful of the effect that you're trying to achieve. So if you want to play down something or you don't want to draw as much attention to it, you might use the parentheses. And if you want to add emphasis, then you use dashes. All right, so let's talk about how to use these kinds of punctuation. So parentheses are typically used to close up material or set off material that is supplementary, which just means extra, or explanatory, anything that's going to further explain or add any additional detail for the reader. And I have to give you a large note here about how we punctuate and capitalize within parentheses because it can be a little bit tricky. So when you are using parentheses within a sentence, so you between a capital letter and a period, you want to put something parenthetical. You don't use a capital letter when you're starting whatever your parenthetical is, even if what you have within the parentheses is a complete sentence. You also won't use any ending punctuation unless it's a special piece of punctuation, which I'm going to get to in a moment. But you do want to use internal punctuation just like you would in any other sentence. So if what you put in the parentheses should have a comma, if you're listing something, or if it even should have a semicolon or a colon, you put that in the parentheses. But no capitalization and, for the most part, no ending punctuation. So here's my exception to the rule with the ending punctuation because it's English. We always got to have an exception. If you have a special piece of punctuation, if you're asking a question within the parentheses or you're making an exclamation, then you put those special pieces of punctuation in the parenthetical. So if you'll notice in my example, I smiled. Who would have done otherwise? Notice that the who is not capitalized, even though that would be a complete sentence on its own. Because it's within a larger sentence, we don't capitalize it. If this weren't a question, we wouldn't have any ending punctuation. But because it's a question, we put the question mark within the parentheses. All right, so I smiled. Who would have done otherwise? And said goodbye. Okay, so special pieces of punctuation, they go at the end of parentheticals. However, periods you wouldn't use. All right, and then if you are having your parenthetical statement outside of the body of a sentence, it's going to be on its own, then you do capitalize the beginning and you do use a period at the end within the parentheses. So you'll see how this example looks different from the previous example. We hurried home the next day. That's the end of a sentence. So the parenthetical is on its own, so we have to capitalize it. It was only too true that the river had risen, period within the parentheses, and then we start a new sentence. Here are a couple other ways that we use parentheses. You're probably not going to do a ton of this in your writing, but you might see it in maybe science textbooks or math textbooks or even maybe social studies textbooks. And we use parentheses just to put references to diagrams or charts in our writing. And if we're going to use any enumerations where we're numbering things or lettering something, then we put those figures in parentheses. And you'll notice that there's no period. There's no other piece of punctuation within the parentheses with enumerations. We just put the number or the letter within the parentheses and move on. And it's still a list here that we have, and you'll notice the commas still come after the items in the list, even though they're also being separated by the numbers. All right, the dash. On the opposite end of the emphasis spectrum, we have the dash, and we use these to mark an interruption in thought. Okay, so either an interruption in someone's speech or an interruption in the sentence. That's typically what a dash is used for. And we form a dash by making a longer piece of punctuation. In a word processing program, you use 2 hyphens. If you're writing it out, make sure that your line is a little bit longer than a hyphen. And the reason why I want to make this clear is because a hyphen and a dash are 2 different pieces of punctuation, and they have 2 different uses. So make sure you're getting in the habit, if you are using the dash, type 2 hyphens, and if you keep typing, the word processing program should automatically make that a longer line for you. Because this is a special piece of punctuation, you want to use it sparingly. If every other sentence in your writing has a dash, it loses its effect. You're not going to draw the attention of the reader as much as if it's a once or twice thing, okay? So our first reason for using the dash, if you have an interruption in thought or an interruption in speech that's written down, say you're in a play and you see a dash at the end of your line in a script, that means that the person who comes in after you is supposed to interrupt you. And we see this sometimes in short stories or novels when we're using dialogue. This means that the person is interrupted by something else or someone else. So look at this example. The chemistry student began to say an organic solvent will only work with when her phone rang. So that dash at the end is telling us that she is abruptly cut off by this other item, her phone. We also can use it to substitute for it is or they are, and in this way it's kind of like a colon, but we typically don't use the dash for lists of multiple items like you might see with a colon at the end of a sentence. So if you look at this example, there was only one person suited for the job.
Latoya Berry, please come to the attendance window.
Pardon that interruption. There's only one person suited for the job, Mr. Lee. And that dash, you could say it was Mr. Lee. But in this case, we want maybe a little more of a dramatic effect, and so we're using the dash here. You can also use the dash in a similar way that you would use parentheticals for any supplementary or explanatory information, but here, again, you want to use it for more emphasis. It's not to de-emphasize information. So you want to make sure that what you're putting in there is something you want your reader to pay attention to. So let's look at this example. Mr. Lee is suited to the job. He has more experience than everyone else in the department, but he has been having some difficulties at home recently and would probably not be available. The writer here, it seems, wants to draw your attention to Mr. Lee's experience, and that's why this information is put in dashes. Another reason that we use dashes, and this one is maybe a little bit more for clarity. If you have an appositive, and remember an appositive is a word or phrase that is renaming a noun in a sentence, a noun that comes before it, okay? If we have an appositive that already has internal punctuation like commas, if we're listing something, rather than add more commas, which is what we usually use to set off appositives, we use the dash here for clarity so that we're not overloading our sentence with commas. So here, our roommates, Carolyn, Haley, and Allie, are all buying Monogram shirts. Because we have a list of names in that appositive, we use the dashes to set it off just again so we don't have a ton of commas in our sentence. So here are two very special pieces of punctuation. Please remember that they are special pieces of punctuation and they should not be used in every other sentence, but now you are empowered because you know how to use them and you can add some stylistic elements to your writing to make it a little bit more interesting. If your teacher has instructed you to do so, there should be exercises below just to help you practice. You can also take these if your teacher hasn't instructed you just to get some extra practice.